The fire began before anyone saw it, before the flames rose into the night sky, before the alarms were shouted across the plantation. It started in silence, in darkness, in a place filled with sugar and wood and heat, waiting to be awakened. And by the time the first man noticed the smell of smoke, it was already too late, because something had been set in motion that could not be stopped. Welcome to Story of the Black Past, where we uncover hidden stories, powerful truths, and forgotten moments from history. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from, your city, your country, and the time you are watching this. And if you have not subscribed yet, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Thank you for being here. Stay until the end, because this story will keep you thinking. You will not want to miss a single moment. Now relax, remove all distractions, and pay close attention as we begin. On a plantation where sugar was everything, where every grain meant profit, power, and control, there lived a man whose hands shaped iron, whose skill made tools, repaired chains, fixed the very system that held him captive, and yet those same hands held knowledge of fire, of heat, of how things break, and his name, though rarely spoken by those who claimed to own him, was Elijah. Elijah was not like the others in the way he worked, not because he worked less, but because his work required something different: attention, precision, understanding, and because of that, he was given access to spaces others were not: the forge, the tools, the storage areas, the places where metal met fire. From morning to night, he worked with heat, shaping iron until it bent to his will, watching how it changed under pressure, how it weakened, how it strengthened, and over time, that understanding extended beyond metal. It became something broader, something connected to the world around him. The sugar warehouse stood near the edge of the plantation, large, filled with stacked barrels and dry materials, a place of value, a place protected, but also a place of risk, because sugar, when stored in certain ways, when exposed to certain conditions, could become something else entirely. Elijah knew this, not because he had been told, but because he had observed, because he had learned, because he had paid attention in ways others did not. The plantation owners trusted him in a limited way, not with freedom, not with choice, but with responsibility, because his skill was useful, and usefulness in their eyes made him manageable, predictable. But they did not understand something important. Skill brings knowledge, and knowledge creates possibility. Elijah moved through his days as expected, repairing tools, shaping metal, doing what was required, but inside something had been building, not quickly, not loudly, but slowly over time, shaped by moments, by experiences, by things he had seen and could not forget. There were reasons, there were memories, there were moments that had stayed with him, and those moments had not disappeared. They had settled, waited, grown. The warehouse itself was always watched, but not constantly, not with the kind of attention people believed, because routine creates comfort, and comfort creates gaps, small openings where attention fades, where certainty replaces awareness. Elijah saw those gaps, not immediately, but over time. The way the guards moved, the times they changed, the moments when the space was less watched. Because even the most valuable places have patterns, and patterns can be understood. Days passed. Nothing changed on the surface, but beneath that surface, something was forming. Not yet action, but intention, clear, focused, waiting. The night it happened felt no different from the others at first, quiet, still, the kind of night where everything seems settled, where people move without urgency, where the world appears calm. But calm can be misleading, because calm often comes before change. Elijah moved as he always did. No rush, no sign, no difference, because difference is what draws attention, and attention is what he could not afford. The warehouse stood as it always had, silent, full, unaware, but inside conditions had already been set, small things, careful placements, details that seemed ordinary, but were not. Fire does not always begin with flames. Sometimes it begins with preparation, with knowledge, with patience. And on that night, all three came together. The first sign was not light, it was smell, a faint trace, barely noticed. Then smoke, thin at first, almost nothing, until it became something. By the time the flames appeared, rising slowly, then faster, then out of control, the realization came too late. This was not an accident. This was not chance. This was something planned. The alarms came quickly. Shouts, movement, confusion, men running towards the fire, others shouting orders, water being thrown, effort everywhere. But fire, once it takes hold in the right conditions, does not listen. It spreads, it grows, it consumes. The sugar, the wood, the structure, all feeding it, all adding to its strength, turning what was once controlled into something unstoppable. The warehouse burned, not slowly, but completely. And as the flames lit up the night, as the heat pushed people back, as the structure began to collapse under its own destruction, one truth became impossible to ignore. This had been done, not by accident, but by design. Elijah stood among the others, watching, silent, unseen, because the most powerful actions are not always the ones that are visible. Sometimes they are the ones that happen without anyone knowing who started them. And as the fire continued to burn, as the plantation watched something valuable turn to ash, a question began to rise, not just what happened, but who made it happen. The morning after the fire did not feel like a new day. It felt like something had been taken, something important, something that could not be replaced easily. And as the smoke continued to rise from what was left of the warehouse, the plantation stood in a strange kind of silence, not the usual quiet of routine, but the heavy stillness that follows something unexpected. The masters walked through the remains with controlled expressions, but their movements revealed more than their words. Slower steps, longer pauses, eyes scanning for answers that were not there, because what they were looking for could not be found in the ashes. It had been planned in a way that left nothing behind. They spoke of loss, of damage, of cost, measuring everything in value, in numbers, in what had been destroyed. But beneath those words was something else, something they did not want to say openly, the realization that this had not been an accident, that someone had acted with purpose, with understanding. Among the enslaved, the reaction was quieter, more controlled, because while they also saw the destruction, they understood something deeper, that this was not just loss, it was a shift, something that had broken the certainty that had always defined that place. Elijah moved through the morning as expected, his hands busy with small repairs, his presence steady, his expression unchanged, because nothing draws attention more than difference, and he knew that in moments like this, the safest place to be was where no one thought to look. But inside, his thoughts were not still. They were active, aware, measuring the response, observing the movement of those in power, because what happens after an action is just as important as the action itself. The masters began their search for answers, not in a calm or structured way, but with urgency, questioning workers, watching behavior, looking for anything that might point to a cause. But the problem they faced was not just lack of evidence, it was lack of understanding. They did not know what to look for. They did not understand how it had been done. And without that understanding, their search moved in the wrong directions. Some blamed carelessness, others spoke of accident, a spark, a mistake, something simple that had grown into something larger, because accepting a simple explanation is easier than facing a deliberate one. But not all of them believed that. A few looked deeper, not at the fire itself, but at the possibility behind it, because fire like that does not begin without reason. And reason suggests intent. The guards were questioned, their routines examined, their positions reviewed. But nothing clear emerged, only gaps, small moments where attention had faded, where nothing had seemed wrong, where everything had appeared normal. And that was the problem. Everything had appeared normal. Elijah knew this would be the case because he had built his plan around normality, around patterns that were expected, actions that did not stand out, small changes that would not be noticed until it was too late. He had not acted in one moment, he had prepared over time. Small steps, careful adjustments, nothing that would draw attention on its own, but together. Something powerful. The warehouse had not been destroyed in a single act. It had been set up to fail, to burn, to collapse under the right conditions, and when those conditions came together, there was no stopping it. The masters began to feel something unfamiliar. Not just anger, not just frustration, but uncertainty. Because what they faced was not something they could easily punish, not something they could point to and say, this is the cause, this is the person, this is the solution, and uncertainty weakens control. The plantation felt different now, not just because of the loss, but because of what the loss represented. A break in order, a sign that something within the system was not as secure as it seemed. Elijah watched all of this quietly, understanding that the fire itself was only part of the story, that the real impact was not just the destruction, but the doubt it created. Doubt spreads. It changes how people think, how they act, how they trust what they once believed. And once doubt takes hold, it does not leave easily. Some of the masters began to change their behavior, moving with more caution, watching more closely, speaking less openly, because even without knowing exactly what had happened, they understood that something had shifted, and that shift made them uneasy. Among the enslaved, the understanding moved differently, not through fear alone, but through recognition, because they had seen the power of something done with thought, with patience, with knowledge, and that recognition carried weight. But no one spoke Elijah's name, not because they knew for certain, but because some things are understood without needing to be said. The search for answers continued, but it led nowhere, because the truth was not something that could be easily uncovered. It had been hidden within ordinary actions, within routine, within the space where no one expected anything to change. Elijah continued his work. The forge still burned, the metal still shaped, the tools still repaired. On the surface, nothing had changed, but beneath that surface, everything had. The warehouse was gone. The certainty was broken. The belief in control had been shaken, and in its place, a question remained. Not just what had happened, but who had the knowledge to make it happen, and if it had been done once, could it happen again? The reason did not begin with fire. It began long before that, in moments that did not seem connected at first, moments that could have been forgotten, ignored, pushed aside. But memory does not always work that way, especially when what is remembered carries weight, carries pain, carries something that refuses to fade. Elijah remembered clearly, not every detail, not every word, but enough to understand what had been done, enough to know that what happened was not an accident, not a mistake, but a choice made by someone who believed there would be no consequence. It was a day like many others on the surface, work moving as expected, people following routine, nothing unusual, nothing that would draw attention, until something did, something small at first, a sound, a shift, a moment that changed everything that followed. A man had been punished, not for something serious, not for something that deserved what came next, but because punishment in that place did not always need a reason. Elijah had seen it, not from the center, but close enough to hear, close enough to understand, and that moment had stayed, not loudly, not in a way that demanded action immediately, but quietly, settling, waiting. That man had not survived long after, and the reason given had been simple: weakness. But Elijah knew better. He had seen enough to understand the difference between weakness and what had actually happened, and that understanding became something he carried, something that did not disappear with time. The name of the man responsible had been added to his mind that day, not written, not spoken, but fixed, clear, unmoving. That was the beginning, but it was not the only moment. There were others, different days, different situations, but the same pattern, power used without thought, without limit, without consequence. And each time Elijah saw, he listened, he remembered, because remembering was the only thing he could do at first. Action was not immediate. It could not be, because action without understanding leads to failure, and failure leads to exposure. So he waited, he watched, he learned, not just about the people, but about the place, about how things worked, about how small changes could lead to larger outcomes. The forge became more than a place of work. It became a place of learning, a place where heat, pressure, and material revealed their nature, where he saw how things could be strengthened, weakened, shaped, or broken, depending on how they were handled. And over time, that understanding extended beyond metal. It became a way of seeing everything. The warehouse was not just a building, it was a system, a structure built on materials, conditions, and habits. And like any system, it had limits, it had weaknesses, it had points where pressure could create change. Elijah did not decide suddenly. There was no single moment where everything came together at once. It was gradual, built over time, each memory adding weight, each observation adding clarity, until the idea was no longer just a thought, but something real, something possible, something that could be done. The fire was not just destruction, it was response, not loud, not direct, but precise. Because he understood that a single act done correctly could reach further than many smaller ones. The warehouse held value, not just in what it stored, but in what it represented: control, profit, power. And by targeting that, he was not just destroying materials, he was sending something deeper, a message that did not need words. Back on the plantation, suspicion began to shift. At first it had been wide, uncertain, spread across many possibilities. But as time passed without answers, it began to narrow, not towards certainty yet, but towards smaller circles. Attention moved to those with access, those who understood tools, those who moved through spaces others did not. And Elijah, without doing anything different, found himself closer to that circle than before. Not directly, not openly, but close enough. A few of the masters began to notice him differently, not with clear suspicion, but with a kind of awareness that had not been there before, because when something happens that requires knowledge, people begin to look at those who have it. The blacksmith, the one who works with fire, the one who understands heat, the one who moves between spaces. The thought was not yet fully formed, but it existed, quiet, growing. Elijah sensed it, not in words, but in attention, in the way eyes lingered, in the way questions were asked, in the way silence felt different around him. And he understood something important. The fire had been successful, but it had also changed the balance. The space he once moved through without notice was no longer the same. It was narrower now, watched more closely, filled with new risk, but he did not panic, because panic leads to mistakes, and mistakes lead to exposure. Instead, he adjusted, the same way he had always done, watching, learning, adapting, because survival had always come first, and it still did. The masters continued their search, still without answers, still without proof, but no longer without direction, because now they were beginning to understand. This was not random, this was not careless, this was done by someone who knew, and that realization brought them closer, not to certainty, but to the possibility of it. And as that possibility grew, as attention slowly moved, as the space around Elijah tightened, the story shifted again, from action to consequence, from silence to suspicion. And the question that now began to rise was no longer just who did it, but what happens when the one who knows comes close to being known. Suspicion does not arrive loudly, it moves in quiet ways, in small changes that are easy to miss if one is not paying attention. But once it settles, it begins to shape how people see everything around them. And that was what was happening now, slowly, steadily, as the memory of the fire refused to fade. The masters had not found proof, not a single clear piece of evidence, but they had begun to think differently, to question more, to look at familiar things with unfamiliar eyes, and that shift, though subtle, was dangerous because it meant they were no longer searching blindly. They were narrowing their focus. Elijah felt it in the air, in the way people moved around him, in the way conversations paused when he came near, in the way questions were asked with a different tone. Not direct, not accusing, but searching, testing, looking for something beneath the surface. He continued his work at the forge, steady, precise, giving no reason for attention to settle on him, because he understood that in moments like this, the safest action is consistency, to remain exactly what people expect to see. But even consistency can be examined when suspicion grows. One afternoon, as the heat from the forge rose around him and the sound of metal striking metal echoed through the space, one of the masters entered, not as he usually did, not with purpose related to work, but with something else, something quieter, something more focused. He watched, not openly, not obviously, but enough. Elijah felt it immediately, the presence, the attention, the weight of being observed in a way that was not normal, and in that moment, every movement mattered more than ever. He did not stop, did not change, did not react, because reaction draws attention, and attention was what he had to avoid. The master spoke after a while, his voice calm, almost casual, asking simple questions about the work, about the tools, about the materials, but beneath those questions was something else, something probing, something searching for understanding. Elijah answered carefully, not with too much detail, not with too little, giving exactly what was expected, nothing more, nothing less, because balance in words is just as important as balance in action. The conversation continued for a few minutes, then ended and the master left. But the air did not return to what it had been before, because once attention has been directed, it does not disappear immediately. That moment was a test, and Elijah knew it, not a direct accusation, but a step closer. The space around him had tightened further, and that meant one thing: the danger had increased. From that day, the observation became more frequent, not always from the same person, not always in the same way, but present, consistent enough to be felt, even if it could not be pointed to directly. The masters were watching, not just him, but the spaces he moved through, the times he worked, the way he handled things, looking for patterns, looking for something that did not fit. Elijah adjusted again, not dramatically, but carefully, refining his movements, his timing, his presence, because survival in a space like this depends on the ability to adapt without being seen to adapt. The fire had been an act of precision, but now precision alone was not enough. Now it required patience at a different level, because action was no longer immediate. The situation had shifted from doing to avoiding, from movement to stillness. The plantation itself had not forgotten the fire. Even as days passed, even as routines tried to return, the memory remained, shaping behavior, creating a background of tension that influenced everything. And within that tension, mistakes became more dangerous, because now everyone was looking, everyone was aware, even if they did not know exactly what they were looking for. One evening, as Elijah moved between spaces he had walked many times before, he felt something again, not directly behind him, not in clear sight, but present. A presence that did not belong to routine, a presence that was watching. He did not turn immediately, because turning too quickly reveals awareness. Instead, he continued as if nothing had changed, his pace steady, his direction unchanged, but his attention sharpened, focused on understanding what was happening without showing that he knew. The presence followed, at a distance, careful, intentional. Another test, another step closer. Elijah reached a point where the path narrowed, where movement could be controlled, where choices became limited, and in that moment he understood that this was not random. He was being watched, deliberately. He had two options: continue and risk being followed further, or change direction and risk revealing awareness. Both carried danger. Both required decision. He chose carefully, not suddenly, but naturally. adjusting his path in a way that seemed ordinary, moving toward a space where visibility increased, where being seen was normal, where the idea of secrecy became less likely. The presence hesitated, then stopped, because attention thrives in shadow, but weakens in light. Elijah continued, not faster, not slower, until the feeling of being watched faded. But the meaning remained. This was no longer distant suspicion. This was movement toward discovery. And that changed everything. Because now, the question was no longer whether someone would find the truth, but how long it would take, and what would happen when they did. The pressure did not ease, it grew, not in loud ways, not in open confrontation, but in constant presence, in the feeling that every movement now carried weight, that every step was being measured against something unseen, something that was getting closer with each passing day. The masters had not spoken his name, not yet, but their actions made it clear that they were narrowing their focus, no longer searching everywhere, but looking more closely at fewer places, fewer people, and that shift made the situation more dangerous than before. Elijah continued to move carefully, but even careful movement can be tested when attention becomes consistent, because the more someone is watched, the harder it becomes to remain unnoticed. The space for error becomes smaller, the margin for survival thinner. The forge, once a place of routine, now felt like a place of observation. Every strike of metal, every adjustment of heat, every movement of his hands felt heavier. Not because the work had changed, but because the eyes on him had. He did not stop, did not slow, did not rush, because any change could become a signal. But inside, his thoughts were sharper than ever, measuring not just what he was doing, but what others were seeing, because survival was no longer just about action, it was about perception. The investigation moved quietly but steadily. The masters began to compare details, not just about the fire, but about access, about who moved where, who understood what, who had the knowledge to make such a thing happen. And each question brought them closer to a smaller group. Elijah was within that group, not confirmed, not accused, but present, and that presence alone was enough to create danger. One afternoon, something happened that could have ended everything. It was small, almost nothing, the kind of moment that would pass unnoticed under normal conditions. But these were not normal conditions. A tool had been left in the wrong place, not far, not obvious, but enough for someone paying attention to notice that it had been used when it should not have been. One of the guards saw it, picked it up, looked at it longer than necessary, and that small moment created a connection, not a full answer, but a direction. The tool belonged to the forge, to Elijah's space, to his responsibility. The guard did not accuse, did not act immediately, but he remembered, and memory, in a moment like this, becomes dangerous. Elijah noticed the shift later, not directly, but through behavior, through the way the guard moved, the way his attention returned to the forge more often, the way his presence lingered longer than before. And in that awareness, Elijah understood something clearly. The space for error was gone. What had once been manageable was now critical. What had once been safe was now exposed to risk. The list of actions he could take became smaller, more limited, more final, because now the situation had reached a point where waiting carried as much danger as acting. The masters began to focus more directly, not openly accusing, but asking more pointed questions, narrowing their attention, testing responses, observing reactions, because they were close enough now to feel it, not the full truth, but the shape of it, and that shape was becoming clearer. Elijah faced a decision, not sudden, but unavoidable: remain still, and risk being uncovered as the search tightened, or act again, not to create destruction, but to change the direction of attention. Both carried risk, both carried consequence, but only one allowed him to control the outcome. He chose, not quickly, but with the same careful thought that had guided everything before. Another action, not like the fire, not large, not visible, but precise. Targeted, designed not to destroy, but to shift. The next incident was smaller but effective, a disruption in a different part of the plantation, something that required attention, something that pulled focus away from the forge, away from the questions that were beginning to form. It worked, not completely, but enough. The masters shifted their attention again, dividing their focus, spreading their efforts, because now they were dealing with more than one problem, more than one possibility, and that division created space. Space Elijah needed. But the cost was clear. Each action increased the tension. Each movement added weight. Each decision brought the situation closer to something that could not continue indefinitely. The plantation was no longer stable. It was reactive, uncertain, filled with questions that had no easy answers, and within that instability, everything became more fragile. Elijah returned to stillness again, careful, measured, aware that the path forward was narrowing, that the choices ahead would not be many, that the time for action was not over, but changing, because survival now depended not just on what he could do, but on when he chose to do nothing. The masters continued their search, closer than before, more focused, more determined, because they knew now this was not chance, this was not simple, this was someone, and that someone was near, very near, and as that understanding settled, as the distance between suspicion and truth became smaller, the story moved toward its final stage, not of action alone, but of consequence, of exposure, of what happens when something hidden can no longer remain unseen. The final turning point did not come with a loud accusation or a sudden arrest. It came quietly, in the way everything had been moving from the beginning, through pressure, through attention, through a slow tightening of space, until there was almost no room left to move without being seen. By now, the masters were no longer guessing. They were certain that someone within the plantation had caused the fire and the disruptions that followed, and though they still did not have full proof, their focus had narrowed enough that only a few remained under close watch. Elijah was one of them, not named openly, not accused directly, but watched, constantly. The forge was no longer just a place of work, it had become a place of observation, where his actions were seen, where his timing was noted, where even the smallest movement could be questioned, and that level of attention made one thing clear. The time for hiding within routine was ending. He could feel it in every moment, in the way conversations paused when he passed, in the way guards positioned themselves differently, in the way silence carried meaning, because silence, when filled with suspicion, is never empty. The masters held another meeting, more serious than before, their voices lower, more controlled, but carrying a clear direction. They spoke of narrowing further, of testing directly, of creating situations where truth could not remain hidden. They were preparing to force the answer. Elijah understood this without hearing the words, because the signs were clear, the pattern was complete, and the next step was inevitable. Confrontation was coming, not openly, but in a way designed to reveal, to expose. That left him with very little time, not for another act, not for another shift, but for a decision that would define everything that followed. Remain and face what was coming, or leave, not in a simple way, not openly, but in a way that would require planning, timing, risk, because leaving was not freedom, leaving was survival in a different form, more uncertain, more dangerous, but still possible. The night he chose to act did not feel different from the others, but inside everything had changed, because this was no longer about response, no longer about message. It was about continuation, about whether the story would end where it was or move beyond the plantation entirely. He moved with the same care as before, but now his focus was not on the structures, not on the systems, but on the paths, the routes that led beyond the boundaries he had always known. He had observed them for years, not with this moment in mind at first, but with awareness, always aware. The guards were present more than before, but presence does not guarantee attention, and attention can be redirected. He waited, not for silence, but for distraction, a moment where focus shifted, where certainty replaced awareness, and when it came, he moved, not quickly, not slowly, but exactly as needed, through spaces he understood, through paths he had studied, through darkness that hid more than it revealed. There was no sound, no signal, no sign left behind, because the best escape is the one that is not seen as it happens. The plantation continued through the night unaware, routine holding, structure intact. But by morning, something had changed. Elijah was gone, not missing in a way that suggested confusion, but absent in a way that created immediate understanding. The masters knew, without needing proof, without needing explanation, because absence in a moment like this speaks louder than anything else. The search began, immediate, focused, but already behind, because time, once lost, cannot be regained. They searched the paths, the woods, the edges of the land, but the one they were looking for was no longer where they expected him to be, because he had not moved blindly. He had moved with knowledge, with preparation, with purpose, and that made the difference. The plantation stood in a strange silence once again, not the silence of uncertainty, but the silence of realization, because now the story had a shape, not fully clear, not fully proven, but understood. Someone had acted, someone had disrupted, someone had changed the balance, and that someone had left. But leaving did not erase what had happened. It did not rebuild what had been lost. It did not restore the certainty that had been broken, because the fire had already burned. The doubt had already spread. The system had already been challenged, and those things do not disappear, even when the person responsible is no longer present. Elijah moved beyond the boundaries of the plantation into a world that was no less dangerous but different, because now his survival depended entirely on himself, on what he knew, on what he had learned. No protection, no structure, only awareness, only movement, only choice, but also no limits placed by others. The story did not end at the plantation. It continued, in a different form, in a different space, but carrying the same truth. That knowledge once gained cannot be taken away. That action once taken cannot be undone, and that even in a place built on control. There are always those who learn how to move beyond it. The story did not end with his disappearance, because some actions leave a mark that remains long after the person who carried them is gone, and on that plantation the mark was clear, not just in what had been destroyed, but in what had been changed. The warehouse was rebuilt over time, not immediately, not easily, but eventually, because profit demanded it, structure demanded it, and the masters could not allow loss to remain visible for too long. But even as the new structure rose, it did not carry the same certainty as the one before, because what had been broken was not just wood and sugar, it was belief. The belief that everything within that land could be controlled, predicted, managed without question, and once that belief is shaken, it does not return in the same form. The masters became more careful, more watchful, but also more aware of something they could not fully explain. A quiet understanding that knowledge existed beyond their reach, that those they believed they controlled were capable of more than they had assumed. They did not speak this openly, they did not admit it, but it shaped how they moved, how they watched, how they thought. Among the enslaved, the memory remained in a different way, not as fear alone, but as recognition, because they had seen what knowledge could do, what patience could achieve, what one person, moving carefully, could change within a system that seemed unbreakable. They did not speak Elijah's name openly, but they remembered, not always in words, but in understanding, in the way certain moments were felt rather than explained, in the way silence carried meaning. Elijah's path beyond the plantation was uncertain, filled with risk, filled with unknowns, because freedom, when taken rather than given, does not come with safety. It comes with responsibility, with constant awareness, with the need to survive without the structure that once defined every moment. But he carried something with him, not tools, not objects, but knowledge. The same knowledge that had shaped his actions, that had allowed him to understand systems, to see patterns, to act with precision, And that knowledge did not disappear when he left. It became his advantage, his protection, his way forward. He moved through spaces where others might hesitate because he understood something deeper, that the world is not controlled by those who believe they hold power, but shaped by those who understand how it truly works. And that understanding had been built over years, through observation, through patience, through moments that others might have ignored. The plantation remained, the system continued, but it was no longer untouched, no longer unquestioned, because even a single act, when done with purpose, can create a shift that reaches beyond its immediate impact, that settles into memory, into awareness, into the way people understand what is possible. That is the part of the story that matters most, not just the fire, not just the escape, but the meaning behind it. That knowledge is power, that patience can be stronger than force, that even in the most controlled environments, there are always cracks, always weaknesses, always ways for those who see clearly to act. So when you think about this story, do not only think about destruction, do not only think about loss, think about what it represents, what it reveals about systems, about people, about the difference between control and understanding. Because those are the lessons that remain, those are the truths that last. Thank you for watching Story of the Black Past. If you stayed until this moment, I truly appreciate you. Tell me where you are watching from, your city, your country, and the time. And if you have not subscribed yet, take a moment to like and subscribe, because there are many more stories like this, stories that go deeper, stories that reveal what has been hidden. And remember this, power is not always where it appears to be. Sometimes it exists quietly, in knowledge, in patience, in the ability to see what others do not. And when that kind of power is used, it can change everything, even if no one sees it happen.